At Orb Media, which is a journalism organization, we have tried to figure out what is going on, and we have detected this global shift. And of course, we also have encountered some answers to why it is happening. And some of the answers we get from young people in very different countries is that they would like a different kind of organization and a different kind of political movements that are more horizontal, and where it is not the old people, as they tell us, that is deciding everything.
All right, and what about you, Thabo? I mean, when it comes to the sort of shift that we're seeing, when it comes to students, when it comes to the youth, under 40 at this stage, what are you seeing?
Well, I think firstly, thank you very much for having me. The shift in student politics particularly needs to be analyzed from its historical context and framing the development of student activism in our context, higher education. And the shift is a gradual shift from passive engagements, from having started off with the normal conventional ways of engaging to a more robust and a more radical confrontational approach, owing to the lack or the deteriorating patience among students across the country and across the world at large. And I think it also feeds into the new threads of ideologies of thinking and thought, particularly around black consciousness in the context of South Africa. Black radical feminist thought and intersectionality has brought about a new variation in terms of how students engage mostly with the state.
And Vanessa, what are you seeing is behind this shift and the sort of impact that it's having?
Thank you for having me, Jane. Indeed, as Thabo has rightfully indicated, this is perhaps a way in which students are asserting their power as citizens, as active agents in society. And it also forces us to really think about students as knowledge producers and not standing outside or standing on the sidelines of what they know and what they believe should be known. So I think this shift really is, as you rightfully as well indicated to begin with, South Africa is really quite at the forefront of this. We've had a very active, politically active youth for the longest time, if you consider our history, but also in the contemporary period, we see that the South African youth is really not shy, and we've been known to be a society that is more than willing to put our laundry out in the open. And so it also creates platforms for us to really engage across multiple dimensionalities and different mediums. And I think it really tells us something about a real impatience and dissatisfaction with the current way in which things are panning out. And also it really brings into question what our democracy is and on what foothold, or rather on what pillar it stands.
Naja, your global journalism organization, Orb Media, has conducted the research that we touched on a little bit earlier on. You went into incredible detail. Tell us a little bit more about the focus of this research and what sort of lengths you went to get to where we are now.
We at Orb Media, we are looking at global issues, and we were curious about how young people feel about democracy and how they feel about politics, because there have been a lot of reporting about that. And then we gathered nearly 1 million answers from 128 countries, and there we discovered this global kind of paradigm shift where you can see that young people all over the world, they have similar considerations. And then we began reporting and asking young people in different countries about the issues. And what was very fascinating to me as a journalist is that we got similar answers from countries as different as Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, Poland, USA, Nicaragua. They say similar things, and it was not connected to whether the young people were kind of left-wing or right-wing. They could have all different political beliefs. But they had this common message that they felt that traditional politics is not made for young people, and that young people are not being heard.
All right, now, our reporter went to several campuses to hear students' response to this research, and let's hear what they had to say about it.
We live in a country full of vibrancy and varying opinions. But what do we really think about politics and voting? Is it a generational matter? Well, the numbers seem to suggest it just might be. So, let's find out. What is the cutoff age in terms of government leaders for you, and why?
I think the cutoff age should be maybe 40, 42, because you're not so much of a youth, but there's a bit more wisdom. The reason why I'd say we need a more realistic cutoff age is because it's evident in our country how things are done, that we're still stuck in the past. For example, my biggest issue is the educational system. We are not moving with the times, and we are not trying to learn from the mistakes of the past educational system. We're still using the same system.
The reason we are having all these situations happening in South Africa, it's because our ruling party is recycling, leadership instead of producing new leadership. So it's like buying second-hand clothes. It can tear, you have to stitch it up. There is nothing new about it.
On these campuses, there is no shortage of debate. As we explore the numbers further, we ask, what is the importance of civil action and protests in 2018?
Voting is good, especially for an opposite party, the EFF or the DA or whomever you want, just to make the competition better and more intense. So if the ANC knows that if they screw up once, then, the DA or the EFF will take over, so they have to be strong, But equally important is the protests, So how would the government know that they're doing something wrong if you don't protest about it?
I've been disillusioned with a lot of, everything going on in South Africa and the politics. I just feel like most of us feel like there isn't a point to vote anymore because nobody hears any of our grievances. And, we find it pointless.
But I think that it's really important because either way, somebody's going to get elected into that position. So whether or not you think that your one vote makes a difference, it does. Like in the greater sense of things, your one vote contributes towards the outcome of the election. So I think that it's important for younger people to consider that before they just dismiss elections as not helpful.
The youth is the most affected group when it comes to unemployment. So does this change their view of government and of the country?
I'm 34 years old. I've never voted, and the reason why I haven't voted, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't living here in South Africa. I've been back for about 2 years, and I've noticed what goes on in the government. There's so much corruption, and it starts from the top and it filters down and stuff. So. And all these political parties, for me, DA, EFF, ANC, iyafana, ngazathi bazalwa umama oyi-1.
Khuluma nge-corruption sisi, ngikhuluma ngendaba yokuthi bayidlela bodwa le phezulu, thina stophi nix. Bayafika besithembisa uma befuna amavoti, but end of the day abasinikezi lutho. Badla bodwa nje babona behamba ngezinto ezi-branded, but thina-ke sibavotela asitholi lutho. Kunamanje abona sisi sayigugisa siguga ngemizimba yethu sayivocavoca ukuthi sithole kwethunjini because ugovernment ayisizi ngalutho.
Masego Rahlaga, Johannesburg.
Thabo, do you think that for many students, for many of the youth, that protesting, taking to the streets has taken the place now of voting, that it could be more important?
I think, if we frame it like that, we give across a very, perhaps, somewhat distorted or misleading narrative that protest is the first form is the first option that students are put forward. In fact, many a times we have noticed that there's been an exhaustion of the internal processes, but the lack of positive response, or even any response for that matter, has driven matters to an extreme end. And so by the time matters reach a question of protest, it's more of an expression of frustration, of impatience, of disappointment, anxieties more than anything that feeds into protest across the country. But what we do appreciate rather is protest as a form of demonstration, as a form of politics, which is welcome and protected in a democracy. What we don't condone rather as a union is that of violence. And we need to separate the two, particularly when having such sensitive discussions.
Vanessa, what is more effective when it comes to protesting? A violent protest or a peaceful one?
Jane, it is quite a bit of a tough one considering where we're at as a nation and also our history with protests. I think the two might not necessarily be mutually exclusive. I think that for example, as movements progress or as collectives progress and as dissent, really deepens and the real issues are starting to get discussed, there might be a need to just strategically pick one over the other. So I think the moment in which a movement is in and the moment in which the issue is in, it might require a particular type of protest action. And I think that movements tend to really be calculated in terms of deciding which movement is best feasible and which one would be best suited for a particular situation. So I think it is very much dependent on the context. It is also dependent on the lifespan of a particular collective and the issue at hand. Some issues are more pressing than others and require quite aggressive methods. And that is not to say that, as Thabo has rightfully pointed out, that this is the first point of contact with authority, but it certainly is one of the ways in which people really feel that that is the last option. When you are not heard through the ballot paper, you tend to really then want to kick the door down.
And look how effective it is, Naja, when it is done successfully. If you look at the demonstrations, the protests that we saw in the streets across the US against guns and how effective that was, and that politicians sat up and listened.
It is, and exactly that movement. They are right now trying to transform that protest into being votes in the upcoming midterm elections here in United States. But what I find, of course, is both voting and participation as protesting is all very important in a democracy. But what I find interesting is with this global shift, we risk coming to a situation where either young people are leaving vote at the table and effectively power at the table, especially in countries where young people believe the government is corrupt, because our data shows that young people in countries where they think the government is corrupt are really less likely to vote. So that is one bad scenario. Another bad scenario could be that governments are not really listening to the young voice because the young people are not part of the traditional structures. So we raise the question, does politics need to be rethought or reimagined somehow?
And let's get a comment from Sandy from Stanger. Go ahead, Sandy.
Hi, good evening to your panel there. Thank you for the opportunity. My position in this entire thing is, yes, protest is important, but when protest becomes a riot, does it really answer to the requests and the demands that we have? Number one, we have seen protests becoming violent, where destructions of institutions take place. You are requesting certain needs and demands. So how do you expect your demands to be met when you're incurring additional costs? We take cognizance of the fact that yes, there are some pressing needs that's required by students. But then when it comes to an institution where you are churning out your academics and they're coming out with this mentality of protesting, and it comes up with the mentality of violence and destruction, when they qualify, is that not the mentality that they go out and portray out in the streets? Hence, look at what's happening at state capture. Are we not feeding it from our tertiary education right down from where the institution starts?
Okay, Sandy, let's bring in Thabo. Thank you very much for that. Thabo, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think one of the as a union, we've had this discussion before. One of the most loosely used terminologies, particularly when it comes to issues of politics and the youth, is that of violence. We tend to give violence a very loose translation as an approach from the lens of the student demonstrating in a violent form. And when we do that, more often than not, we ignore the systemic violence that takes place, the institutional violence. I heard him speak about a relation of corruption and voting participation or voter behavior. But again, we also need to speak into the corruption of the system itself, and that understanding students not voting as a form of politics in and of itself, abstaining from voting is their own political expression in order to heed their various demands. And so we need to, think deeply and broadly about certain terminologies and certain concepts in order to understand how youth participate in politics. But I think even beyond that, again, from the report that was released, one of the major issues we had as a union is the idea to oversimplify very complex matters or to perhaps give it a universal appeal. We need to understand and I appreciate the data sampling in terms of 128 countries that was conducted, but also to further look and zoom into the nuances to explain perhaps certain trends in youth participation towards politics.
Okay, Vanessa, I think something that does tie up many of these countries, many of these protests that they all have in common is social media. How important has that been to this development?
Social media has really quite, in the last couple of years, really come up as something, or as a form of real protest in the medium itself, and also in thinking about its uses and the fact that its uses are really quite widespread, right? And social media really allows for the framing of narratives by those that were or are generally silenced, right, by particular or by mainstream communication channels. So I think it's a very important and central in thinking about how is it then can we shift and change structures, right? How can we change violences? How can we dismantle problematic ways and also really call, speak truth to power? And social media has really enabled young people to do that. Although I must say that even social media itself, it is not without its problems. For example, the question of access. Not everyone. When we know in South Africa, you have a really the line between, or the gap between those who have and those who have not is quite large. Okay. So the question of access is still prevalent here, especially with the use of social media as a form of protest.
Okay, Naja, briefly, if you will, where do you see this growing united voice heading to?
I think it will be interesting to see. I think, talking about social media, I think some of the shifts we see in politics and are going to see in the near future will maybe remind a little bit about the shifts we have seen in media use. I think the young generations, they are doing politics differently, like they are doing pretty much everything else differently.
Thabo Shingange, Vanessa Mtlanye, thank you very much. And if you want to get a full report on this, you can be found at orbmedia.com. Now, it is Heart Awareness Month. Next up, we talk to the Heart and Stroke Foundation and a medical practitioner to find out how to take better care of our hearts and our health.